The GPS is an amazing invention because we don't have to know in advance how to get someplace, which for me, a map person, is sometimes frightening. And when that GPS is telling me where to go and it doesn't feel right, because I want to be able to see it on a map. I want to see the whole thing laid out ahead of time. And so I don't always want to trust the computer voice that's talking to me. You can show that next slide there. Hopefully GPS is not going to steer us in the wrong direction, right? Well, we know that God is not going to steer us in wrong directions, even when sometimes it feels like the direction doesn't feel right. And so that's what we are looking at today. The 2 weeks before I took a week off, we were looking at the reality that God is going to direct our paths when we trust Him and when we acknowledge Him, as it says in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, that if we acknowledge Him and we trust Him, what's He going to do? He's going to make our path of life straight. He's going to lead us in the right direction. And sometimes we look for God's plan in our life without seeking His presence. We're just looking for the plan as if it's a crystal ball kind of thing. But when we seek the presence of God, then the plan of God reveals itself step by step in only the way that God can do. Because as we get to know Him, as we get to know His heart, we learn what His will is, we learn what His ways are. And when we come to make decisions day by day, then we know that God is speaking to us and leading us as we go through this path of life. Now, we have to be really careful. Sometimes you hear people say, God told me something, right? Because, it could be true or it could be a figment of your imagination. There was a time when a famous televangelist said, God told me that unless you send me this certain sum of money that I'm going to die, okay? Now, did God really tell him that? Or was that a figment of imagination? Was that something that was used as a ploy? We got to be careful when we say, God told me this. There were times when I thought God was leading me in a certain direction, but then it turned out that was more maybe my will. That was more my try to fit God into my map that I wanted for me. And sometimes we do that. And so we got to be very careful when we feel like God's telling us something, and we have to be able to check it. And God's given us different ways to check that. Because, first of all, Satan can blind us. Satan can lead us down a wrong path as well. But we can lead ourselves down a wrong path as well. And when we look at the way God speaks to us, the way that it all kind of lines up is first by the Bible, okay? God's not going to tell us to do something that goes against what His prescribed will and ways are. If I'm trying to pay the mortgage on my house, I'm going to be praying about it and saying, God, I need this provision. He's not going to tell me to go out and rob a bank to be able to do it, right? Because that would be against His will. Because stealing is against His will. Now, obviously, when we are looking for God's will in our life, it's probably not going to find it in the Bible that's going to tell me where I need to move to or what job I'm going to take. But there will be principles there that will help me make good decisions, that will help me to do what He wants me to do. The second criteria we looked at was just the support of other Christians. If there are people in your life who love God and love you, then they can speak into your life. They get to see things a little more objectively sometimes than what we see ourselves. And when we ask others to help us to be able to seek God's will together, it's such a great comfort when they're able to speak into your life. And we can do that for other people as well. And we talked about that a couple weeks ago, that we need to be able to be speaking the truth and seeking God's will, not just for our own lives, but for one another, and being able to speak into each other's lives in that way. Next week, we're going to talk about the role of prayer and being able to listen to that voice of the Spirit. Now, this is a real key component, so I'm just kind of introducing it today. We're going to get there next week and talk about how do you really listen to God's little inner voice there. Now, it might come sometimes as an audible voice, okay? I think it's rare, but sometimes God gets our attention through an audible voice, but usually it's going to be this inner voice of being able to listen. Are those things in my thoughts, is that really me thinking it, or is it God putting it in there? And we have to test those things, and we'll talk about that next Sunday, so I hope you stick around for that one here. But the third criteria, today's sermon, we're going to look at circumstances. We say that things happen for a reason, and that kind of becomes a trite saying sometimes, but yet there really is a greater purpose in our life, and things do happen. Circumstances come our way, both good and bad, to be able to direct us as well as we move through life. And that's what we're going to take a look at today. So really, when we see that God's word and people of faith that are speaking into it, and circumstances and to the spirit of prayer, when those things come together and they all line up, then we know that God is leading us. And we need to be, as Christians in our faith, taking steps, keeping those ingredients in mind. Another story from God's word comes from the book of Esther. You know, back in the days when Israel was in captivity by the Persians, one of the young Jewish women, whose name was Esther, was being raised in this land by her older cousin or uncle, we're not sure who it is, Mordecai. And the king announced that he was looking for a new wife. And he set up a kind of a beauty pageant, okay? You get to try out, okay, to see if you fit to become my new wife. And Esther was thrown into that whole group there. And she never let people know that she was from a Jewish origin. I mean, these were people that were slaves in that land. They were the people that were in captivity. They were looked down upon. But that was hidden from her biography of becoming the next queen. But she won the contest and became the queen, even though she had this ethnic identity that was not known to the king or to anyone. And after this took place, there was an evil man who was sort of the vice president, of the king there. He started bad-mouthing all the Jewish people. And he's talked the king into a plan that says, we need to get rid of these people. We want to just get rid of these Jews. They're no good for us anymore. Let's just wipe them all out, execute them all. And the king thought, that sounds like a good idea. If you think we should do that, he obviously wasn't thinking for himself, but he trusted this guy, much to his demise. So Esther is thinking, oh my gosh, my people are all going to be, there's going to be a genocide here. Is there something I can do about it? And so wisely and publicly, she had to make it known to the king who she was, what her identity was. And knowing that this could be dangerous to her personally and to her people as well. But she was thinking, maybe God will use me to be able to save my people. And so we think about her circumstances, okay? Here she is, she's chosen to be a queen, even though she's from a poor, captive slave group of people. She was a Jew when the Jews were about to be slaughtered. She did have a potential voice to the king, but for her to just enter into his presence without an invitation was not something that was acceptable, and she could lose her life for even just suggesting that, let alone what her request was going to be. In the book of Esther, chapter 4, we read about a conversation between Esther and this cousin Mordecai as they were thinking about what to do about their predicament. And we read about their conversation here. And Mordecai replied to Esther and said, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther replied to Mordecai and said, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. You know, we got this set of circumstances here. Some are good. She's the queen. She got picked out of all the women in the land to be the queen. But the bad circumstance is that she and her people are about to be annihilated. So what's she to do? Mordecai says, let's trust God. Let's turn to others for support. And let's await and see what kind of outcome will happen. Fortunately, the circumstances changed to a better outcome. God used her courage to approach the king and to be able to put out this request to not annihilate her people, and they were saved. And that phrase that comes from that passage, for such a time as this, it's become kind of a motto of sorts to describe being at the right place at the right time in God's plan. For such a time as this. What are the circumstances in your life, even right now, that God has placed in your life? How does it fit for you and me being called for such a time as this? We think about the times. We think about what's going on. We look at our place in life. And what is God doing with us in the midst of all these circumstances? There are no coincidences, because circumstances are part of God's plan. This coming Thursday, Alina and I celebrate our 20th wedding anniversary. But 21 years ago at this time, even though we knew each other, I definitely had no idea that we would end up being married. By this time, Alina had had an inkling of the possibility, but I was still pretty clueless because I had moved to Russia with a motto that I was never going to marry a Russian girl. And I held very sternly to that for at least 8 years. And I thought I was being wise, but actually I was just being stubborn and trying to be in control of my life. But during this time, some friends of mine were speaking into my life and saying, you need to rethink that position, okay? They were worried. I was 34 years old, okay? So it's like, come on. You know, your chances of meeting somebody are very slim if you're going to exclude all the Russians that live around you here. I mean, 99% of the eligible women around me were Russian. So they were trying to say, you need to chill, get rid of that standard, and just be open to what God would do. But I was still struggling with that. I had a couple dating attempts with some American girls. Those ended up disastrous. And so they're saying, open up your heart a crack and be willing to see what God would do. During that time, Alina, we basically knew of each other, but she had gotten involved with our youth ministry team, our leadership team, and so we had just done a summer camp together, and we were getting to know each other during that time. And then we had a weekend where our leadership team, we got together and we were just having meetings all weekend, planning out our next year. And so we were eating meals together and doing all kinds of things together. And that Sunday morning, we all had breakfast together at my apartment before we were all going to go to church. The rest of the leaders all took off for church, and Alina and I stayed behind to clean up breakfast. So we're washing dishes, drying dishes, and both having this conversation about how marrying somebody that's a foreigner is probably not a good idea. So we were both discussing that together. And so we finished up doing the dishes and we took off for church together. But when we got there, the service had already started. We were late getting in there, and the only seats available were on the front row. So we just sneak in, we sit down on the front row together. And that day, the sermon was about marriage. And so the pastor was up there preaching, and right in the middle of that sermon, I heard this voice that said, this girl next to you is going to be your wife. I mean, it was out loud. I heard it, okay? And I thought the whole room had heard it. And I was like, where did that come from? And I started fidgeting, and I got all nervous, and I'm looking around, and everybody's just looking straight ahead, so I didn't think anybody had heard it but me. And when people say God told me something, or I heard this audible voice, I usually would be pretty skeptical about it, but I can tell you that day I heard a voice. And I guess God had to use that to crack open my heart a little bit more, because I was being so blind and being so stubborn and in control of my life. So I didn't know what had happened there, and so I was all nervous and thinking, what's this supposed to mean? This is a brand new concept for me here. I mean, she was smart and godly and cute, but I wasn't in the place where I was ready to risk getting into a relationship with somebody who was Russian. That was still not on my list. But about that time, I had to move into a new apartment. And so I had an agent trying to help me find an apartment to move into. And the area I was looking into was about 10 miles long and 3 miles wide. Okay? And we're talking about skyscraper apartment buildings. You're talking about over 1 million people in this area. So she's looking for an apartment for me. And when she finally found an apartment that was available and fit the description and the price and everything else, it turns out it was on the same street that Alina lived on. Okay? Out of that big area, circumstance put me in the same neighborhood, We used the same subway stop. We were a 10-minute walk from each other's place. And then we started running into each other by accident. Now, of course, we lived in the same kind of area, but still to run into somebody and when there's a million people around, that didn't happen very often. But we would run into each other. And we just, all of a sudden, it's just like, man, she's right there in front of my eyes. And I started to notice something that I didn't notice before. So my defenses went down. And long story short, we weren't yet dating, but we were involved in the youth ministry. We were together a lot. We had these awkward moments, whether I was supposed to walk her home at night or not. And so we went through that whole playing that out. But I went to talk to some friends of hers, a couple that she knew really well, that happened to be an American and Russian couple. They knew her really well, and I went to them and said, I think I'm falling in love with Alina, but I don't know. Do you think it's a good idea that I pursue this relationship? And they were all for it. They were all for it because they knew of me, they knew her, and they said, we think you guys would make a great couple. So that was getting the approval of some other voices. And then I went to America for 3 weeks. And while I was there, we started emailing each other. One day I would send an email, then she would send an email back. This is back when that's the best way to get in touch with each other. And so during those 3 weeks, we started to get to show more attention to one another. And then when I came back, I said, hey, I think we should date. And actually, we were talking about the story of Esther when we had that conversation. So that kind of fits in with today's sermon as well. But circumstances, all these circumstances that it looked like, it's kind of like we were on remote control. God was leading circumstances in this decision in my life. I mean, the fact that God had directed Alina to get involved in that youth ministry, because she was involved in some other things with college students, and so she took a big risk to get involved here. The fact that God brought our apartments close together, the fact that we would accidentally bump into each other, even that whole breakfast cleanup that day, even our conversation and that sitting on the front row together at church, God was orchestrating something there. And this isn't just a love story, it's a God story, because God's fingerprints were on our lives at that time. And as we were seeking Him, we found each other. Now, that doesn't mean that every circumstance is going to help find us the love of our life. Believe me, I had found apartments before and never ended up in the neighborhood with the love of my life, okay? So, I mean, we can't just, always assume that every circumstance is going to turn into a love story or something beneficial or something successful in our lives. I mean, I was single through all my 20s and early in my 30s, and no circumstances ever lined up before, even though I would try to make them happen. But seeking God was something I was doing. As I was seeking God at the right time and place, God brought our lives together. Now, if it would have been 10 years earlier, she would have been 11 years old, so that wouldn't have worked out. But she grew up, and at the right time and place, God brought our lives together. So, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, it reminds us that we trust in the Lord with all our heart. We don't lean on our own understanding. In all our ways, we acknowledge Him, and He will make straight our paths. So if we seek the heart of God, we seek the presence of God. Even when circumstances come along, we're able to make sense of it. We got to be careful, though, not to manipulate circumstances or to read into circumstances, because usually circumstances only make sense in hindsight. At the time, getting the apartment in the same neighborhood and running into each other, it was a coincidence, but I didn't know what it meant. Looking back, I could see what it meant. But sometimes circumstances in the present don't make sense. We never know what our circumstances are going to lead us towards. Sometimes we meet somebody for the first time, and that person becomes a significant person in our life. And you look back and you go, remember when we first met? And you had no clue that they would become a good friend or somebody that would be meaningful in your life. We go through experiences, good and bad, that change the ways that we live our lives and the way that we can fully realize God's potential in us. If you've gone through a tragic heartache, something very difficult, then you're prepared to be able to be God's person to help other people in those same circumstances. You know, the thing that is out of control in our life might be really scary, but God will lead us to be able to even use those things for things that later on we'll look back and see and have some thankfulness, even for those hard things. Sometimes we see possibilities in front of us and we think the stars are all lining up, and then everything crashes, right? And we feel disappointed. We're like, God, it all made sense. It all was working out, and then it crashed. But we got to remember that even if things don't turn out, God has a different circumstance. And maybe that was to prepare us to be able to trust God, even when things don't work out. Because we have to trust Him when they do, and we have to trust Him when they don't. We live in a broken world, and circumstances often come in negative ways. There's natural disasters, there's illness, death, accidents, victimization, injustice. Those are circumstances that can throw our lives into a panic if we don't believe that God is in control of even the negative things that happen around us. God's presence is with those who trust Him, and sometimes God will join the ones who are in the fiery furnace and they come out unscathed. But other times, like Stephen, the first deacon, he was being stoned to death. He looked up into heaven, he could see Jesus standing there, but Jesus didn't come to his rescue. Jesus didn't come and block all those stones, but said, come be with me. So sometimes He saves us from the furnace, sometimes He doesn't save us from the stones. And we have to trust Him, and He'll make our paths straight. Circumstances in our lives are very much like wedding vows. We say for better or for worse, right? And circumstances can be better or worse, but they both move us in God's direction. But they're broken parts of this planet that are not part of God's plan. But He never removes His presence in the middle of the pain. God didn't cause the hurricane. He didn't send the hurricane. And He might intervene in the hurricane, or He might not intervene. But no matter what, He's with us in the middle of even destruction. God doesn't cause the death of a person. He might intervene and keep them alive longer, and He might not. But He is with us, even when we lose. God doesn't cause the victimization from an evil person. He might intervene, He might not, but He's with us in the middle of the pain. It's unclear in our limited understanding why He intervenes here and He doesn't intervene over there. We don't understand His role in the midst of circumstances, but we have a God who does intervene. There are miracles and supernatural things that happen. And according to the mystery of His will and His ways, as we get near to the heart of God, we find that we can trust Him if we keep our eyes on Him. We keep our eyes on Jesus. We look into His wonderful face. And the things of earth, whatever happens, happens. And it might make sense and it might not make sense. But if we're looking to Him, we're able to understand much better. It sounds simplistic. It's not. It's definitely not easy. Trusting is hard. Reading and understanding the signs and circumstances are very hard to do, especially in the moment. But circumstances do shape our lives, and we learn to bend with them and make the most out of each moment and realize that we're never alone, but we're actually held. That reminded me of a song that was out a few years ago, and it reminds us that even when the world falls apart around us, that we are being held by Jesus. I'd like us to watch this clip.